Welcome, and thank you for trusting us with this deep dive. Today, we are tackling a really critical chapter in the history of Pakistan, the period right after the death of its founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, back in 1948.
And it's a period that often gets, glossed over. We tend to jump ahead to the big military takeovers or the regional conflicts.
Exactly. But what if the real crack in the foundation of the democratic experiment happened way earlier and much, much more quietly?
That is precisely the argument in the sources we're looking at today. We're digging into excerpts from Zaheer Ahmad Meer's work, and he argues that Pakistan's, its core structural imbalance was set in those first few months after Jinnah was gone.
A failure of political succession, basically.
A huge one. It created this vacuum, and that vacuum allowed for an institutional power grab that, really set the course for the state's entire future.
So our mission today is to unpack how that actually happened. How did the senior civil service, this administrative machine they inherited pretty much whole from the British Raj, how did they go from being servants of the state to its rulers?
Its de facto rulers, yeah.
Yeah.
And the analysis suggests this wasn't just some bump in the road. This set the stage for decades of political instability and this constant problem of unaccountable power.
And what's so crucial here, what the author really zeroes in on, is that the first big power struggle wasn't East versus West Pakistan or even civilians versus the military later on.
No, not at all. Fundamentally, it was bureaucracy versus democracy. And that lens is so important because it helps us see how the whole system was sort of warped right from the very beginning. It was almost like a preemptive constitutional crisis.
Okay, let's unpack that. I mean, it's like you're building a massive skyscraper, and the architect, who is also the chief engineer and the site foreman, just disappears. He leaves the site before the foundation concrete is even fully cured.
Right. And the steel beams aren't all bolted down yet.
Exactly. And what happens? The sources give us a really striking answer. A highly disciplined, super organized, and permanent group on site, the project managers, they just step in and claim ownership.
And they don't just finish the original blueprint, they start rewriting it to benefit themselves.
That's a powerful image. Okay, let's start at the beginning with the man himself. So we start with Jinnah. The source material describes him as more than just the founder. He's called the balance. That suggests, a role that goes way beyond a typical head of state.
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just running the government. He was the central axis point, the institutional stabilizer. Everything revolved around him.
And this was, because of his personality, his charisma?
That was part of it, for sure, but it was also structural. You have to remember, he was both the Governor General and the President of the Constituent Assembly at the same time. His authority was just overwhelming. Nobody could challenge it.
So he had both the legal power and the moral force.
Exactly. And the analysis points out he used that power to maintain three very specific checks on the system. First, he made sure the politicians stayed, reasonably responsible. He kept them focused on national unity instead of just their own regional squabbles.
Which must have been a huge issue right after
A
partition.
massive issue. Second, and this is the big one for our discussion, he was absolutely rigorous in making sure the bureaucracy, that powerful civil service, remained subordinate to the political leadership.
They answered to the elected officials, not the other way around.
That was the rule. And third, he kept the other new institutions, like the judiciary and the early military, disciplined and within their constitutional lanes. He was basically the only person who could look at a powerful general, a top bureaucrat, and a squabbling politician and say no to all three of them.
And have them actually listen.
And have them obey, yes. That role is, it's completely non-transferable. You can't just elect a new Jinnah.
No, of course not. So when he dies in September 1948, it's not just that the leader is gone. It's like, as you said, the central processing unit of the whole state has just been yanked out.
It's a total system crash. And into that crash steps this political class that inherits power. But the sources are pretty blunt about them. They're described as weak, divided, and frankly, very inexperienced.
They just didn't have his command, did they?
Not even close. They didn't have his discipline, his authority, or that unique moral force. A lot of these figures were freedom fighters, not necessarily administrators. They were new to the game of running a country, and they were immediately consumed by their own rivalries.
Fighting over who would get to wear Jinnah's mantle.
Pretty much. And they were just politically ill-equipped for the moment.
But hold on, shouldn't we expect them to be a bit weak and divided? The country was brand new. In that situation, shouldn't the bureaucracy, the professionals, have been the neutral bedrock, the ones who supported the politicians during the transition?
That's the ideal, right? That's the democratic model. But the analysis here argues that without Jinnah's personal control, the political environment just devolved into chaos almost overnight.
So the bureaucrats looked at these politicians and saw, what, amateurs?
Exactly. They saw amateurs consumed by, as the source puts it, petty power plays. And the bureaucracy itself, remember, was highly trained, disciplined, and had this deep institutional memory from the colonial administration. Suddenly, they're the only organized group left standing.
Which brings us to that really tragic insight from the source material. It says, a democracy without a Democrat at its center becomes a battlefield of egos instead of a system of accountability.
It's a perfect summary. It's a tragedy of timing. The democratic structures, like Parliament, they just weren't mature enough yet to impose real accountability on their own.
So you take away that one unifying personality.
And you're left with a bunch of fractured personal ambitions. And when that happens, rule of law takes a backseat to political survival.
And the only entity that isn't fractured, the only one that's organized and disciplined, is the civil service.
Absolutely. They're the ones who knew how to actually run the state. They managed the budget, they collected the taxes, they moved the files, they maintained the chain of command, they represented competence and stability.
Things the political leadership just couldn't offer at that moment.
Not at all. And that competence, both real and perceived, gave them immediate and massive leverage over these new, struggling political ministers.
And so the big question became, would they use that leverage to serve or to rule?
And the sources are very clear in the answer. They chose to rule.
Which sets the stage perfectly for this idea of the capture.
In that political vacuum, the sources say the bureaucracy stepped forward not to serve, but to steer. And you have to pay attention to those words. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't just them passively filling a gap.
It was an active, conscious decision.
A conscious movement to seize control. And to really get why they were able to do it so effectively, you have to look at the culture they came from, the Indian Civil Service, the ICS.
The so-called steel frame of the British Raj.
Exactly. The ICS was a service designed by the British for one purpose, to rule the subcontinent, not to serve it. Their entire training, their whole institutional DNA was about paternalism, about keeping a distance from local politics.
About being the masters.
About being the masters, yes. They were trained to see themselves as inherently superior to the locally elected representatives they had to deal with.
So when Jinnah is gone, and this weak, divided group of politicians takes over, that old institutional culture just snaps back into place.
It defaults right back to ruling, though. The whole idea of being subordinate to politicians, which was Jinnah's absolute top demand, was, it's just an unnatural concept to them. It went against their professional identity.
They saw themselves as the guardians of the state against these temporary, incompetent politicians.
They did. This institutional superiority complex, you combine that with their practical monopoly on how the state actually functioned, and they were perfectly armed for the capture.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. How did they actually do it? The sources list some very clear, almost insidious mechanisms. This wasn't a coup with tanks in the streets.
No, this was a coup by paperwork. First, they started to influence cabinet decisions. They realized that if you control the flow of information to a minister, you control the minister.
So they would prepare the briefs, the policy options.
Right. And they could frame those options in a way that made the bureaucratically preferred outcome seem like the only logical choice. They could bury other options in jargon or exaggerate the technical problems with a policy they didn't like.
So the politician asks, hey, can we do this big land reform program?
And the top bureaucrat comes back with a 100-page report full of logistical hurdles and budgetary impossibilities, and then says, but minister, here's a much more modest, technically feasible option we've prepared. Which, of course, changes nothing and keeps the status quo.
Wow. Okay, so that's one. What's next?
The second was taking total control of policy files. This is so important. It meant they could control the speed of government.
They could slow walk things they didn't like?
They could sit on a file for months. They could lose a key appendix. They could delay until a minister got frustrated or, more likely, got shuffled out in the next cabinet reshuffle. Procedural gridlock was their ultimate weapon.
Just those two things alone would basically neuter an elected government. You can't make a decision without their approval, and you can't implement a decision without their consent.
And then there's the third mechanism, dominating all the administrative channels. All the money, all the appointments, all the enforcement, it all flowed through their strict hierarchies.
Huh.
Politicians couldn't get any visibility into what was actually happening.
It's like a black box.
Completely. And fourth, and this was maybe the most damaging to the whole democratic idea, they just started to openly marginalize the elected representatives. They'd treat them with this thinly veiled contempt in meetings. They made it clear that the politicians were irrelevant to the real business of the state.
This was the quiet coup. This was the unfolding of exactly what Jinnah had warned against, a state being run by unelected power.
And the sources emphasized this was strategic. It wasn't just happening, it was a deliberate maneuver, which is why that quote is so powerful. Where democracy hesitated, bureaucracy advanced. It did not fill the vacuum, it captured it.
That distinction is everything. Filling a vacuum is passive, capturing it is active. It's a hostile takeover.
It is. It suggests they locked down the state's entire operating system before the democratic bodies could even learn how to log in. They had unity and a plan. The politicians were just fighting amongst themselves.
So they captured the vacuum. But that's one thing. It's another to make yourself the permanent, ultimate authority. How did they go from being the managers to being the final arbitrators of the state?
Well, that's the next step, isn't it? That's the transition into what the sources call the invisible parliament.
Right. So while the politicians are, as the source says, quarreling among themselves, the bureaucracy isn't just running the trains on time. They're deciding where the tracks go.
Exactly. They fundamentally redefined their own role. They stopped being neutral administrators and started acting like power brokers, like policy guardians.
They adopted this mindset that only they had the wisdom and the expertise to save the country from collapse.
Yes. And the analysis says they eventually became the true rulers of the young state, even if the democratic window dressing, the ministers and the parliament, remained in place.
Okay, let's break down that term because it's so powerful. The bureaucracy became the invisible parliament. A real parliament is public. It's accountable. It's where debate happens out in the open. How does an invisible one work?
It works in the shadows, through control. The sources point to a few key mechanisms. First, an information monopoly. They controlled all the data. Revenue numbers, defense assessments, population statistics.
Yeah.
Everything.
So they controlled what facts the minister even got to see.
They could filter it, frame it, spin it. By monopolizing the data and the institutional memory, they made sure any policy debate happened on their terms. If you control the facts, you control the argument.
It doesn't matter who the minister is at that point. Okay, what's the second mechanism?
Personnel and loyalty. They controlled who got promoted and where they were posted. All the key jobs in the capital and out in the provinces went to people who were loyal.
Loyal to the minister.
No, loyal to the administrative class, to the institution of the civil service itself. This created these powerful, informal networks, these elite circles that were totally impenetrable to political outsiders.
So they were building a self-perpetuating system. If you were an ambitious young officer, you learned very quickly that your career depended on pleasing your bureaucratic superiors, not the temporary politician you were assigned to.
Precisely. And the third pillar of their control was a financial veto. In theory, the cabinet and parliament approved the national budget, but in practice, the bureaucracy controlled all the detailed spending.
They held the purse strings.
Every last one. If a political government wanted to fund, say, a big social program, the bureaucracy could just start it of funds. They'd claim technical difficulties or unforeseen budgetary constraints. Meanwhile, their own institutional perks, their salaries, their pensions, their subsidized housing, were always protected.
This is what the source means when it says this one distortion altered Pakistan's political DNA. That is a huge claim. What does that mean to have the state's DNA altered so early on?
It means the fundamental premise of governance was flipped on its head right at birth. The whole idea that the elected official leads and the administrator serves, that was gone. It was replaced by the reality that the permanent state machinery holds the final veto over democracy.
So every political structure built on top of that, every election, every constitution is built on a flawed foundation.
A structurally compromised foundation, yes.
Yes.
It basically made the failure of democracy down the line almost inevitable. The engine of the state wasn't serving the people, it was serving itself.
And what gave them the confidence to do all this, to play this long game?
One single, simple fact. Permanence. The source puts it so bluntly. Governments change, bureaucrats stay.
They knew they could outlast any politician.
Any minister, any prime minister, any government, they just saw them as temporary annoyances. This allowed them to pursue what the sources call institutional interest over national interest. And we really need to understand that distinction.
Okay, let's define that. National interest is what's good for the country, right? Building strong democratic institutions, public welfare, transparency.
Even if it means making the administration's job harder. Institutional interest, on the other hand, was about one thing: preserving and expanding the power, privilege, and secrecy of the administrative class itself.
So a policy to give land to poor farmers is national interest.
But the bureaucracy kills it because that same land is earmarked for a new exclusive housing colony for senior civil servants. That's institutional interest winning out.
And their entire system, the control over files, the loyalty networks, the financial veto, it was all engineered for that kind of self-preservation.
Exactly. They weren't strengthening the state's democratic institutions, they were strengthening themselves at the expense of those institutions. It created this permanent, unaccountable power structure that was woven so deeply into the fabric of the state that it became almost impossible for any later government to remove.
This whole systematic replacement of duty with self-interest, it just brings us right back to the beginning, to the very things the founder warned them against.
And that's the absolute tragedy of it. They heard the warnings, and the moment the person who gave them was gone, they chose to ignore them completely.
So let's talk about that original mandate. The sources are really clear about Jinnah's warnings given directly to the civil servants. What exactly did he tell them?
I mean, he couldn't have been more direct. He told them, and this is a direct quote, "You are the servants of Pakistan. Do not become its rulers."
It's so unambiguous. There's no gray area there. The politician is the master because they're chosen by the people. The bureaucrat is the servant who implements the master's will.
That's the fundamental democratic contract. But the analysis points out that the moment Jinnah was gone, those words were, quote, forgotten, which suggests, that the ambition to rule was always there. It was just dormant, waiting for the opportunity.
The mindset shifted from duty to domain.
That's a great way to put it. Duty implies service and subordination. Domain implies ownership, or right to control the state. The bureaucracy started to think of Pakistan as their project, not the people's.
And the speed at which they moved, the coordinated way they captured power, it suggests they saw the vacuum not as a crisis to be managed for the nation's sake,
but as a golden opportunity to get rid of this inconvenient new democratic system of accountability.
So we see the whole terrible progression. Jinnah creates the balance. He dies, creating a vacuum. The bureaucracy captures the vacuum, and they solidify their power as this permanent, unaccountable class, the invisible parliament.
And that sets a precedent that has echoed for decades. When an institution acts so decisively in its own self-interest right at the birth of a nation, that behavior becomes the norm. It becomes institutionalized.
So every civilian government that came after was born with this powerful internal enemy, an enemy that was smarter, more organized, and believed it was superior.
And indispensable. This leads right to the author's final devastating conclusion about what this meant for Pakistan's entire democratic project. It's framed as a profound national tragedy.
Yeah, the final quote from the source material just pulls it all together. It's heartbreaking.
It is. It says, "The tragedy of Pakistan is that democracy lost its voice before it even learned to speak." I should just sit with that for a second.
Lost its voice before it even learned to speak. What does that mean in practical terms? It means you never develop the habit of real parliamentary debate.
Exactly. No tradition of ministers being in genuine control of their own departments. It means you just normalize the idea that the bureaucrats were really in charge.
The democratic system was essentially silenced by paperwork and procedure before it could ever grow strong enough to govern.
It's like putting a gag on a child before it can even learn to form words. That's the analogy here. The capacity for political language, for governance, it just never developed properly.
So the entire foundation was built on a kind of lie. You had the appearance of civilian rule, but underneath, the reality of administrative control.
And that template, that idea of a permanent establishment stepping in, became the justification for everything that came later. When the military eventually took over, they could point to the chaos and incompetence of the politicians. A chaos the bureaucracy helped create and perpetuate and say, see, the permanent organized institutions have to step in to restore order.
The bureaucracy set the principle. When politicians fail, the establishment rules.
That structural imbalance where administrative power is seen as more legitimate than political democratic authority, that's the foundational struggle that, according to this analysis, still shapes the country's destiny today.
It just forces you to look past the more dramatic events, the coups and wars, and see that the original sin, so to speak, was administrative.
It was a quiet internal capture. The analysis really makes you confront this idea that the instability wasn't just a series of random accidents. It was the logical outcome of a state whose internal machinery was compromised right from the start.
So to sum this all up, we've mapped out this incredible transformation. You go from a state being carefully steered by a single charismatic leader who's balancing all these competing
To
forces.
a state where the unelected permanent administrative body quietly seizes control and becomes what the sources so brilliantly call an invisible parliament.
And I think the key lesson here for understanding how governments work anywhere, not just in Pakistan, is that these huge structural problems often don't start with a bang.
No, they start with a whisper, with quiet administrative power grabs that happen when the political center is weak or divided. This idea of institutional interest replacing national interest is the core danger. It's how any permanent bureaucracy, if it's left unchecked, will end up serving itself instead of the public.
We've spent this whole time talking about a distortion that altered the country's political DNA right in its infancy. So if this permanent power class was so successfully woven into the very fabric of the nation from day one, controlling the money, the information, the jobs, how does a state ever fix that? How do you dismantle it decades later?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? The analysis seems to suggest that the only way to restore that balance is through political leadership that has the same kind of unity, discipline, and moral authority that Jinnah had.
You need a political force strong enough to finally override that built-in administrative veto.
A force that can successfully reestablish that original contract.
Mhm.
The politician commands, the civil servant serves.
The sources define the conflict so clearly. If the original tragedy was that democracy lost its voice before it learned to speak, then the ongoing challenge is how a political class, which has to operate inside that same broken system, can somehow find a way to learn that language and finally assert its authority over the very machine that was designed to serve it. And that's something for you to think about as you consider that tense, difficult, but absolutely necessary relationship between political will and the a permanent bureaucracy in any democracy that's fighting for its own voice.